Hi, and welcome to everything there is to understand about the menstrual cycle. So, before we jump in, you really could go through the workbook by yourself and get the gist of everything. I tried to make it so that if you're like, I'm not a video person, you could read the workbook. Or if you're like, I'm not a reader, I'd rather listen, you have this option as well. So do not feel obligated to watch this recording if you'd rather just read it and work through the material on your own. I may give a couple extra insights, but I really tried to make sure the workbook was comprehensive so that, later down the road, if you just wanted to download a page or see something, you could do that. So let's jump in to understanding the menstrual cycle. So there are four phases for the menstrual cycle, and it officially starts with the bleeding phase, then moves into the follicular phase, then ovulation, and then lastly, luteal. And then, as long as you're not in menopause or having any type of health condition issues, it will start back over again into a cycle. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into this. Again, you can follow along with your workbook and take some notes, or you can just listen to this and think, boy, that was insightful. I'd love to learn more. So, the bleeding phase, or what you will hear people call sometimes menstruation, marks the start of a new cycle. So, that's really considered days 1 to 5 if you go by the standard. So, if you look in a textbook, it's going to tell you that the average cycle length for a period is like 21 to 28 days. But if you have a condition, if you're in perimenopause, if you're approaching menopause, you might start to find that you have longer periods. So, really, sometimes you can even say it's more like day 1 to day 35. So, yes, there is kind of a textbook, but it's not the only way. So, if you're like, oh no, mine is not 28 days, Tracy, that's okay. We will be talking later in the membership about what if it is irregular, what if it is too long. Those are coming. So if you're like really panicked, like Tracy, mine are like 75 days, don't worry. We've got some information coming to help you. So the bleeding occurs, of course, when the uterine lining sheds, and that's what is resulting in the whole bleeding that we go through. And during this phase, estrogen and progesterone levels are at their lowest. And that's kind of what leads us to be at reduced energy, why we're tired, why it might be hard to wake up when you finally wake up in the morning. It might be one of those, like, one of my favorite things to say is like, you make plans when you're in your follicular phase and you feel amazing, and then the event is actually in your luteal, and you're like, why did I do that? I just want to lay on the couch. So it is normal during this phase to not feel like your optimal self. So when the bleed is done, you've now entered into the follicular phase, and that will last between the bleed and ovulation. Now, ovulation, they usually say, again, if you're following the 28 day, it's around day 14, but that doesn't always necessarily ring true for everyone. But for just to have a workbook here, we're going with like the optimal. And then from there, I've got a slide later that tells you about some things if it's a little bit longer. So during this phase, you have what's called FSH, and it is in the pituitary gland, and it stimulates the growth of your ovarian follicles. And eventually you have one that's maturing into an egg. And so then your estrogen shoots up. It's got the lining of the uterine lining is nice and thick because it wants you to get ready to make that baby. And then you often will feel like this is the one of the best times of the month. So you feel like your mood is good, your energy's great, your cognitive function, I can remember things better. And this phase is all about getting ready for that egg to possibly be um turned into a baby. And so that's why the FSH is the most dominant hormone that's kind of driving these changes towards let's go in there and let's make that baby. So then you get to the ovulation phase. So again, I said midpoint of the cycle, usually around day 14, but not always, when a surge in your LH hormone triggers the release of that mature egg that we just talked about, and that comes out of your ovary. And during this phase, estrogen peaks and your cervical fluid becomes more fertile as well. And so what's really cool about our cervical fluid when you learn about the process, it's quite amazing what our bodies do. So, when you have the sperm enter, the cervical fluid will kind of get like sticky or webby, and its job is to keep that sperm in there so that it can possibly reach the egg and then start to implant. And so, this is usually why it's a good time around ovulation. That's why it's a good time to try if you are trying to have a family, because you want that extra, like, it's the right time for the egg. You've got the cervical fluid doing its thing. And so ovulation is often going to bring you an increase in, libido and sexual interest. There might be a little bit more winky winky time at each other. Your energy and your motivation are at its highest because it is ready. It is ready to see if we can make that baby. And then you're going to enter the luteal phase. So it begins after ovulation and it's going to continue until you start your next bleed. And during this phase, the corpus luteum forms from the ruptured follicle, and it secretes progesterone to maintain the uterine lining, um, in preparation for a possible pregnancy. And then, as the progesterone peaks, it can lead to mood changes, increased body temperature, and even potential symptoms like bloating, breast tenderness. And then what you'll find is if the pregnancy does not occur, then progesterone and estrogen levels start to drop. And it signals to the body that, we did not make that baby and it's time to prepare to start the menstrual cycle over again. So those are your four phases. So you can kind of see how it's like bleeding, you're not really at your optimal follicular, feeling pretty great. Ovulation, that's the time where you should write a new course or start a new hobby because you are like all in. And then luteal is when your body's kind of like, all right, I guess this didn't take. And then that's when you start maybe getting tired, more hungry, bloated, and all the symptoms. So let's look at the parts in your body that play a role, because a lot of times when people think about the menstrual cycle, obviously they think about the uterus and ovaries. But there is a lot more going on in our bodies that is outside of just our pelvic area. And so this can really help you understand if you are facing irregular periods or you're having problems, why it may not just be your uterus or your ovaries. It could be somewhere else in your body that is giving you a little bit of a problem. So let's take a look first. You see our beautiful body here. The five body parts we're going to talk about. Two are in the brain: the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and then the thyroid, ovaries, and the uterus. So let's start first with the hypothalamus, which is just fun to say, I think. It is super tiny. I think I read somewhere that it's like the size of an almond. So very tiny, but it's a crucial part of your brain. And it's situated just below the thalamus. And it's right above the pituitary gland at the base of the brain. And its role is just in regulating the menstrual cycle by, it's kind of like like it says here, control center for your hormone production and release. So, logically, we all probably understand it had to start somewhere, but a lot of times we're thinking more down in the pelvic area because of the symptoms we're feeling, but it is really all starting up in the brain. And so the hypothalamus is it's responsible for producing I hate saying it, so let's just call it GnRH. It takes like an hour to say it. And that signals the pituitary gland to release two key hormones, which we just mentioned a while ago: FSH and LH. So these two are some big rock stars. They're the ones that are kind of cueing your ovaries like, hey, it's time, let's go. So they're going to trigger that ovulation, and they're also going to regulate the production of your estrogen and progesterone in the ovaries. And then that's what kind of keeps us on the cycle of the menstrual cycle. So now you can see if the LH, the FSH is having some problems already up in the hypothalamus, and they are responsible for kind of regulating the production of your estrogen and progesterone, it is already starting outside of the ovaries. Now, the pituitary gland also plays a role, And so we said it's just, below the hypothalamus. And it's often referred to as the master gland because it plays a vital role in regulating various hormonal functions. And that also includes the menstrual cycle. So it receives signals from the hypothalamus to, hey, go ahead and release those hormones that go directly to your ovaries. And specifically, it secretes FSH and LH, which we just talked about. That's crucial. It's for everything. It's for the getting the ovaries ready for the egg, the process of ovulation, and then also watching those estrogen and progesterone levels. So as you can see, the game to start to keep the cycle a cycle and to get the signals going correctly to the pelvic area for the reproductive parts that we're going to be discussing here in a moment, it's starting in the brain. And if you have a major disconnect between that, you're already going to then have issues down in the pelvic area. So let's keep going and talking about all this fun stuff. So then there's the cute little thyroid shaped like a butterfly. This organ, in my opinion, gets the most frustrating response from the healthcare system. I have had doctors tell me, you don't need to. You don't, your thyroid is fine. I ask for the full panel. I don't get it. Our thyroid controls so much in our body, and it astounds me how quickly people are like, nope, you're fine. It doesn't need it. And it can change everything for you. So, we're going to be talking a lot about the thyroid throughout this membership, but it is located in the front of your neck, just below the Adam's apple. And while it's primarily regulates metabolism, which we all love that, especially as we age, we're like, get that metabolism going. It also plays a significant role in the menstrual cycle. And it's because of the different hormones that it's producing. So the T4s, the T3s, those are going to help regulate your energy levels and your metabolic functions. And so you need it to properly function for the regular release of these hormones, such as, here we are again, estrogen and progesterone. So imbalances in the thyroid hormones, whether due to the hypo or hyperthyroidism, can disrupt your menstrual cycle. You may notice things like irregular periods, heavier light bleeding, or even an absence of menstruation altogether. So, as I said before, we're going to jump into that as we move along in the next few months. But again, here we are. We still haven't made it to the reproductive area. And here's another body part that plays a role in our menstrual cycle. And if it can't do what it needs to do, you're going to have problems. So now we're moving on to the ovaries. So these are, everybody has seen those cute little uterus pictures. Seeing it in real life is a little rough. I like the cute ones where they decorate it with flowers. But our ovaries are the two small, about almond shaped organs located on either side of your uterus. And of course, they play a huge role to the menstrual cycle because that's where our little eggs are, being prepped and ready. And then you need your estrogen and progesterone to tell it like, release the eggs. We're ready. It's ovulation time. So as you can see here, each month under the influence of FSH, and LH from the pituitary gland, one of the ovaries will release a mature egg. And it's basically called ovulation. And so these ovaries also regulate the menstrual cycle. And it's all about controlling our hormone levels. And that's what tells your body what phase to go into. So, are we thickening the uterine lining? Is it time to shed the uterine lining? And the follicular phase is it shedding during the menstruation if pregnancy does not occur. So you've had the bleeding, it's shed it, then you're kind of replumping it back up, getting it ready for the proper ovarian function, and then you're going into ovulation, and then in the luteal phase, if it's not attaching, then we're going to shed that nice lining again. And then lastly, the uterus kind of plays a big part because it's the womb, and it's a pear-shaped muscular organ, and it's right between the bladder and the rectum. So of course, its huge role in the menstrual cycle is where the uterine lining is, and also it thickens in preparation for your egg to have a place to possibly attach and start making a baby. So your estrogen levels are going to cause the uterine lining to grow and become enriched with blood vessels because that's the idea we need. That's the environment that the embryo needs to start doing its job, making that baby. And so, we have on here what happens if ovulation occurs or if it's not fertilized and your hormones drop, you're going to shed the lining. But again, kind of a big role to play in this process. So, we've mentioned some key players, and I want to also pause and add something in here that we're going to talk about later in the membership. But there are the 5 main hormones that play a role in our menstrual cycle. And so we have the GN, RH, LH, FSH. You may not have heard of those as often as you do estrogen and progesterone. Now, what I want to do is just throw everything crazy. Let's just knock it all out of the park. We always think about estrogen and progesterone, but there are actually 4 hormones that have their own jobs to do before we can even get to the third rung, the final tier of 5 other hormones that play into this, which it does include in that final 5 estrogen and progesterone. So do not fret. We are going to be talking about that later in the membership. But I just wanted you to know that we do put a lot of emphasis on estrogen and progesterone, and we should. But if you have 4 other hormones that are not doing what they're supposed to do, then you're going to have problems with estrogen and progesterone. And the reason I share that here is to once again show you we've gone from the brain, the thyroid, ovaries, uterus have a part to play. You have these 5 hormones that need to do their jobs. And now I've just thrown on top of all that there's 4 more hormones that really need to be doing their jobs for estrogen and progesterone in that third tier to even be able to do what it needs to do. And this is why we get frustrated because it's complicated. And I feel like sometimes when we go into the healthcare system, it's like they try to make it very light, like, oh, it's not that big a deal. There's a lot on the inside that has to align to do things properly. So this is just for you to see. If you want to call back to it, you can notice on when you're looking at this on the right side, I have the 28-day cycle written out for you. And then I did a 35-day cycle in case you have any longer cycles or you just kind of want to see a little bit more. Again, a lot of this is science. A lot of this has to do with your body. And that's what this membership is for, is that if you are finding you have irregular or things are not lining up well for you, that is the reason I have a lot of these chats and a lot of these power hours is because I want to be a support to you to let's start Sherlocking it. Let's figure out what is happening on the inside of your body. So we mentioned cervical fluid earlier, and a lot of times you're going to hear it most of the time referred to as cervical mucus, but cervical fluid is that fancy ladylike term. And it is natural. It's a natural secretion from the cervix, and it does change its consistency and appearance throughout the menstrual cycle. There have been some women that I've worked with who are like, I think something's wrong. I have this stuff. I have this discharge, and it's not discharge. It's cervical mucus, and it's doing what it's supposed to for your fertility. And it also kind of tells you where your hormone shifts are at. So, as I have listed here, as estrogen rises, cervical fluid becomes thinner, clearer, and more slippery. And that is to facilitate sperm movement towards the egg. So, basically, without sounding too crass, it's like a lubrication to get that sperm to the egg. After ovulation, as progesterone increases, the fluid thickens or dries up. So we kind of talked about how it kind of gets thicker so that the sperm can kind of do its thing, but then eventually it's going to just dry up. So tracking your cervical fluid can actually provide valuable insights into where you are in your cycle, and it can also help you identify when are you most fertile. And if you're having absence of it, too much, too little, this is all science that we can use to figure out what's going on. So I've given you the 5 phases of what cervical fluid does. So you have your dry or minimal fluid while you're bleeding. Then you have sticky or gummy, and that's usually, again, we're following the 28-day advice, days 6 to 9, basically early follicular phase. Then you get the creamy or lotion-like fluid, and that's mid follicular. And then egg white or stretchy fluid, that's ovulation. And then again, back to that dry or thick fluid, you're going to be in the luteal phase. We'll go deeper into this in the membership as well, but again, this is just an intro to let you know all the things our body does for a menstrual cycle. And it still baffles me that we treat it as like, yeah, it's not that big a thing. It's huge. Look at all this that our body is doing. So I want to give you some insight on why do periods matter? Because let's be honest, if I ask most of you, do you enjoy your period? You're going to respond with no, no, I really don't. So why do they matter? Why can't I get on birth control and just not ever have one? And so I wanted to give you some, just things to think through, things maybe to talk about with your healthcare provider or a practitioner that you see. But really, I just want you to understand more than anything um, why periods matter and what it tells us about our bodies. So, of course, number one, it's an indicator of a hormonal balance. So when your menstrual cycle is operating at most optimal, most healthy, most everything, then you know your overall health is doing pretty well. If you're irregular, if you're having symptoms that are disrupting your work, your social life, things like that, it's your body letting you know, hey, things inside, they're not doing what they're supposed to do. Of course, it's going to support fertility. So if family planning is in your future, you're going to want to get to know your period very in depth, especially if you struggle with fertility. So that's some of the main reasons, but guess what? There's more. So, it maintains your endometrial health. And so you might be like, "Okay, so who cares about that?" That uterine lining that builds up, it has to be shed. It has to be shed. And so what you will see, and I have actually experienced this because I have polycystic ovary. For a couple months, I didn't have a period, and this was back before I knew well, but I was pumped. And then all of a sudden, I started having things that felt like contractions. And what I found out was all of that shedding lining was sitting there. And basically, my body was having to contract it out, almost like a birth, but not as traumatic as a birth would be. When you also have things that are just not doing what they're supposed to, you can have things like polyps or, a condition that might increase the risk of uterine cancer. So this isn't to scare you, but again, it's just to remind you that our body is supposed to do these things. It's optimal health. Then, especially if you, and we're going to be talking about this more, but if you are going into perimenopause or into menopause itself, you are going to be all about your bone and heart health. And let me tell you, if you are in your 20s or 30s right now and nothing is causing you to be menopausal, perimenopausal yet, whatever you do today is drastically going to change what you're experiencing in those phases. So while it feels a ways off, you need to start thinking about it. What you do today is going to change how your bones and your heart work during menopause. And let me tell you, I'm learning that because I'm here. And I sure wish I had taken a little bit better care of myself. It also supports your mental and emotional well being. When your hormones are doing what they're supposed to do, we're not having mood disturbances, we're not having mood swings, you're not finding yourself with anxiety or depression because your hormones are all over the place. And it does protect against certain cancers. Now, this is not a guarantee. I cannot tell you 100%, but if you can do everything you can to avoid cancer in today's climate, I think it's worth giving it a shot. And then lastly, signs of overall health. We talked about that a minute ago. This is such a unique and special thing for bodies that have a menstrual cycle because this is an indicator of overall health. It is one of the things that can tell us things are going great inside or something seems off. Men don't get things like that. So we are very fortunate. And it's hard to remember that when you're in a lot of pain. You can't put your pants on. I get it. But it is a sign of I'm doing okay or I might need to check in on some things. And then supports detoxification. That's always important. We need to detox. It's why we sleep, it's why we drink water. Our body needs to remove toxins. And so that's always an important thing. So I hope you're not listening to this during your lunch hour, but if you are, you may want to stop eating. But your menstrual blood also is telling you things. So you can see the bright red, the dark red, all considered normal. Bright red is like super awesome. Your body's like, yeah, we're doing it. Dark red, as it says, it might have been in the uterus a little longer, but it's still normal. Brown is not anything necessarily to freak out about, but what that is that you've got some older blood that's taking longer. Sometimes that can just be that last cycle. It could be you have a tipped uterus. There's a lot of reasons for it. The thing that I just always encourage people is if you're starting to see brown start to become a part of the cycle, mention that to your doctor. Some of that could be that your body is preparing for some other things, but it's always good to just mention, like, hey, I'm starting to see brown. Any concerns? Anything we need to know about that? Then there's burgundy. So they describe that as that thicker, richer blood. That's usually when you're going to see that is like that heavy, anybody who has a heavy flow, or if you're passing any clots. A lot of us have seen that burgundy shade. Again, still kind of in that normal genre. If you're starting to see pink, they say that that can be mixed with your cervical fluid. It also could say low estrogen levels. So if you're starting to see a lot of pink, again, talk to your doctor, talk to a practitioner. And if you're not being heard, that's what I'm here for. Let's book some time and let's come up with some strategies to get you ready. Now you get into the few that are the more concerning ones. So orange, gray, and black. These are not necessarily the ones that you want to see. I'm not going to give you any type of like medical advice because that's not what I'm here to do. I would just encourage you to be aware that these last three are not optimal blood flows, and these are the time to go ahead and make an appointment with your doctor or practitioner just so that we can make sure that you're being looked at and that everything is okay. It doesn't necessarily mean doomsday, but it does mean let's check in with your doctor. Don't start eating your salad yet because we're going to talk about blood loss volume as well, really quickly here. So you have your light flow. That's what, and you, it is not unusual for you to go through these different ones. So you might be light flow one day, normal flow another, heavy for 2 days. Um, but just for you to be able to talk to your doctor about it, you basically want to understand what each level means. So if it's light flow, it's less than 20 milliliters. If it's normal, it's 20 to 80. Heavy flow is going to be over 80. And that isn't even necessarily like a panic time. But if you're losing a lot more than that, then it's time to talk to your doctor or your practitioner about what you're just starting to experience. As you can see on the heavy flow, the last dot, possible causes heavy bleeding can be linked to hormonal imbalances, fibroids, endometriosis, bleeding disorders, health conditions. But as it says, it should be evaluated by a healthcare professional. I have a heavy flow. I know what's heavy, and then I know when it's like, uh-oh, this seems more than normal. So it's not that heavy flow is bad, but keep an eye on it. Are you changing your pads, tampons, period panties, cups a lot faster? Are you passing large, large clots? It never hurts to just check in and just be like, is this normal? Is what's happening? So let's look at now benefits to tracking your cycle. I do have a few tools in this month to help you start tracking your cycle. And if you're like Tracy, I think my cycle is a hot mess and I don't know where to start. What I would recommend is start tracking your cycle with your next bleed and follow it all the way through from bleed to the start of the next bleed. And then let's meet because I'm going to have a ton of questions if we sit together. And one of the first things I'm going to tell you is, do you track your cycle? And if you say no, I'm going to say, I need you to track your cycle so that we can kind of get a picture of what's happening. Are you ovulating? Are you bleeding in between periods when you should not be bleeding? And so, there's all these symptoms or all these benefits listed on here. But what I want you to know that's most important is it's the field map of your body where I can start to see things. And I have an adorable tracking your cycle chart that you can use that's all emojis. I want to make it super easy where you're just circling each day how you feel, what you're noticing in your body, because there's certain things that we need to also ask. So it's not just even are your hormones, it's all about what are you eating, how are you moving, how are you sleeping. How are you feeling? Are you in high stress right now? There's a lot of questions that I'll ask, and that chart can help us get you moving in the right direction a lot faster. So, as I mentioned, I have the menstrual tracking how to chart in the membership, and that's just a nice little flow chart that shows you how do I track. Then there's the cute menstrual tracking chart that I told you about with lots of emojis and lots of fun. And then I have a menstrual pain tracking tool. Because here's the other thing, if you are experiencing pain, usually that does mean something isn't quite doing what it needs to do. And let me tell you, when I got my training, our coach started the first day and she said, if you're at optimal health, you should not have menstrual pain. And I was like, I'm sorry. That's all I've ever known. And you're telling me I could have, from the beginning, possibly not experienced that, or maybe it's just very, very light, not what like happens to me. And so, if we can track your pain as well, then we can start seeing, was it inside the menstrual cycle, like in the bleed? Are you having pain during ovulation? Is pain showing up in places maybe it shouldn't be? And again, this is not to scare you. This is, we're going in, we're getting all of this laid out. And the reason I'm pushing this so hard is when you take in facts, when you take in papers and you say, I want you to look at this, it makes it a lot harder for the doctor to say, well, it takes some Advil. When you're able to show, look how many days out of the month I'm in pain. Look how many days I'm experiencing anxiety, it makes it easier for them to start looking at our symptoms and taking them a little bit more seriously. If they're not, we're going to talk about this in a later edition. That is going to be all about, maybe it's time for a second opinion or trying to see if you can get a better doctor. I also am aware, especially if you're from the US in this membership, that insurance companies dictate what we do. So sometimes you may not be able to get another doctor, or maybe the doctor you use is who is the best one to use for your insurance plan. And we're going to be talking about, how do you navigate through that? How do you make yourself heard if you can't get a second opinion? Or if you're kind of locked in on who you're mandated to see. And so that's it. That's our menstrual cycle. So, as you can tell, or I hope you can tell, even just going through the basics, you can see how this is a multi-layered process, and why I'm so passionate about menstrual health, because it isn't just, oh, there's my period, 7 days, and now it's done. This is about a full cycle that women are generally supposed to go through every month until they hit menopause. Perimenopause, we're going to talk about that on the menopause track. That can just start all kinds of funky loops. But basically, for most of your adult life, it's supposed to be doing certain things. And there's all kinds of things that we could get into, and I won't get into them here. You're probably going to hear those through my podcast. But there's so many things impacting our bodies, and the menstrual cycle is letting us know, hey, your body needs some help. And it's really fixable. Some things may not be super fast. And that's the other thing I want you to know is, this can be slow moving. We may need to track your period for a month, try a few things, track it again for a month, come back and say what got better, what didn't. And so I would also encourage you to give yourself lots of grace, lots of patience, and lots of understanding that this really is not a quick fix. And I know in today's society we love quick fixes, but the human body is not a quick fix. But it is a well developed, well tuned instrument that will do what it's supposed to do when we're doing the things that it needs for the optimal environment. So do not give up hope. Do not let this frustrate you. We are just getting started. And so if you have any questions, you want to start using some of your chats or power hours to check in with me and say, okay, I think there's some things going on. Let's do it. Let's start cracking away at your case, and let's get you headed towards optimal health. So reach out by email. You can join the Q&A sessions, all kinds of ways to ask me the questions so that we can get you started in the right direction of your goals. All right, I'll see you in the next lesson.